Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to continue our Superhero Spotlight series, and I am so honored today to have Ahon Sarkar. He is the VP of Product and Strategy for Q2's BaaS. Welcome, Ahon.
Hi, thanks. Great to be here and appreciate you guys inviting us.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, Ahon is with Q2's BaaS, and actually, I don't know if a lot of our listeners know this, but Q2 is actually a pioneer in the banking as a service space in the US. They're the ones that helped get, a lot of really familiar household brands off the ground, Acorns, Credit Karma, Gusto, and a variety of others. And so really excited to just talk about the proliferation of banking as a service in the US, kind of what it means and what it's looking like for the future as well. So really quickly, Ahon, do you mind just quickly introducing yourself to the audience and telling us a little bit about the BaaS program at Q2?
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Ahon. I'm our Vice President of Product and Strategy for Q2's Banking as a Service group. As you kind of mentioned, right, we were one of the first folks in banking as a service, initially under the name Camber. Now it's under the name Q2 Banking as a Service. But for the last 4 or 5 years, we really focused on how do you build a system, a platform that allows folks to build differentiated products at scale, right? So we own our own cloud-based proprietary core. We partner with banks on one side and fintechs on the other to kind of create this banking as a service ecosystem where some of the folks you mentioned and others are able to build things that are a little unique in today's financial system.
That's awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to start with a really simple question that could probably fuel at least 5 days worth of conversation. But what is banking in 2021?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think it's interesting that you say what is banking and not, like what is a bank, right? Because I think in the last few years, we've seen a shift from a bank being a place that you go to do banking, right? And now today, banking being something that is being embedded into life, right? It exists inside of lending companies. It exists inside of payroll companies. It exists inside of insurance companies, right? And we're seeing that proliferation continue to increase where banking becomes an activity and not a location, right? I think what's interesting about that is you start to see what happens when you combine banking with other businesses. What are new products that you can create that change the face of the ecosystem that we're so familiar with? So I guess that'd be my quick answer to that.
Yeah, I'm impressed with how quickly you're able to do that because I know it's not a simple answer. So, okay, so if now banking is becoming part of sort of everyday life, right? And obviously there's a huge shift towards digital. That's, we all know that, especially with COVID.
No doubt.
But like if banking is now where you kind of live, where you interact with your apps, how does that actually work? Like how is this actually happening behind the scenes?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are lots of providers today. 5 years ago, that wasn't quite the case, but today there are lots of banking as a service providers. And so the model might vary from place to place, but at the highest level, right, what these companies are doing is leveraging platforms like ours, partnering with what we call banks of record, right, or issuing banks, depending on where you're coming from, and basically combining those with their existing business to create a new product, right? So you might look at someone like Acorns, who made their name in micro investing, right, helping folks who are investing for the first time kind of set up their financial future. They used our platform, partnered with a bank, and were basically able to build banking as a part of that overall offering, but in a way that was integrated to everything else, right? So your roundups are going straight into your accounts. You're suddenly earning these rewards, right? You're able to take that and invest it, and it becomes this sort of seamless ecosystem. So net of it is these companies partner with platforms and banks, build differentiated offerings, embed that in their ecosystem, and then grow their business based off of that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So now that this market's growing so fast, right? We see all the headlines with all these people getting VC funding, and a lot of the platforms are arising to kind of meet those needs. How does one differentiate, right? That's the title of our of our program today, Differentiate or Die, right? Like, how can you actually differentiate, and what does that actually look like, right? I think one thing that I think we've spoken about before is conceptual differentiation versus practical differentiation, and how do you really truly make sure that differentiation is scalable for the future?
Yeah, those are 3 really good questions, right? I'm going to go in reverse order. So I'm going to start with what are those 2 kinds of differentiation. Then we'll go to how do you differentiate for the different kinds of companies that you might be, right? So what is that difference? Well, conceptual differentiation is at the base level something that you can easily replicate, right? So let's pretend that I say, hey, I have a debit card program, and every time you swipe a card, I'm going to partner with this other company that's going to plant a tree every single time, right? Well, that's kind of unique, right? I'm first in market. I'm going out here with that product. But then tomorrow, your company, Carico, right, decides I'm going to partner with that exact same vendor. And then every time I have a swipe, I'm going to plant a tree, right? Well, there goes my differentiation, right? Now we're both doing the same thing. I'm not unique, right? Why wasn't that defensible? Well, because it's easy to replicate, right? Because you can easily create that for your own business. And so practical differentiation is something that's difficult to replicate, right? Where you have some kind of moat. And what that looks like will vary depending on what kind of company you are, right? So I guess that brings us to the next piece, which is how do you differentiate in this space, especially when platforms are offering oftentimes some similar components, right? Accounts or cards or payments or what have you, right? And I think it kind of forks into two, where there are folks who are tackling this as a net new business for the first time, don't necessarily have an existing business. And then there are folks who have an existing ecosystem, right? And are trying to leverage that ecosystem. While we tend to focus on this side, I think in both cases, you can drive meaningful differentiation. And it starts with, think about the problem that you're trying to solve, right? Because oftentimes you'll hear people who come to you and are like, hey, so-and-so competitor has features 1, 2, and 3. Competitor B has features 2, 3, and 4, and C has 3, 4, 5, right? So I want to launch 1 through 5, but for free, right? One, that's not really differentiation. And two, that ends up creating a bunch of problems, right? Because first of all those product hooks cost money, right? And so if you're going to offer all of those at once, you're going to create a business model that isn't necessarily sustainable. Second of all, right, if you're just offering the same thing the user can go get at another bank, why would they switch over to your platform, right? You have to provide them some meaningful value that's better than what they're getting today. And third, I mean, if you've ever been to like a large bank's webpage, you probably feel kind of confused, right? You're like, well, I want to check my balance and I want to know how much I owe on my credit card. And otherwise, I don't really care about all this other stuff, right? And typically when you try and offer everything at once, the user gets overwhelmed. You get that unscalable business model and you kind of set yourself up to fail, right? And so I'd recommend doing the opposite of that, right? Start with, what is the specific problem that I'm trying to solve for who, right? What is the first slice that I'm going to perfect, right? What is the thing that I'm going to do better than anybody else? And then how do I go do that in banking, right? So as an example, we talked about Gusto earlier. I'll bring them up, right? For them, they support hundreds of thousands of small businesses, right? And those folks all have employees, many of whom were hit pretty hard during the pandemic, right? Like people are more cash strapped than they've ever been. And particularly for folks who are underserved, you're kind of living paycheck to paycheck. And your biggest problem is cash flow, right? And so let's say you pop your tire, right? And you need to go get a replacement, but you don't have money from your next paycheck. What do? You go to a payday lender, right? Because they're the only ones who are going to extend you that kind of credit. But then what happens? Well, then I have to go pay 20% of that payment over to that lender, right? Now I have 80% of my paycheck. And then I have to go pay the next payment. And suddenly you end up in this kind of like downward spiral, right? So Gusto looked at that and said, okay, hey, we're the payroll provider, right? We know if you're still working. We know if you've gotten paid. How can we solve that problem for you, right? And so they combined Gusto Wallet, their banking product, with Gusto Cash Out, their sort of like cash flow product, and are offering free cash advances on your paycheck to any of those employees who have a bank account, right? So what do, right? They said, okay, what is my universe? My universe is this population of individuals who are under these small businesses. What is my problem? Those folks are cash strapped and their only alternative basically puts them in their downwards wealth spiral. And what is my solution? Leverage my unique position as a payroll provider to build something different, right? So if you're a net new company, focus on a specific problem, build your business around that, and then expand. If you're a company that has an existing ecosystem like Gusto, as I mentioned, take use of it, right? You already built something that your customers love, right? You already built a moat that's difficult to replicate. What you should be asking is, how can I combine banking with what I already do to make something that didn't exist before, right? And any of those names that you mentioned and others in our client base do exactly that, right? They build something meaningfully different that takes advantage of what they have. So I know that was a little bit of a long answer, but I think the net of it is, don't try and be everything to everyone. Solve a very specific problem. If you have an existing ecosystem, leverage it to create a deeper moat, and make sure that in whatever you build to solve that problem, there is a moment of delight, right? Because think about customer acquisition, right? It's expensive to buy ads. It's expensive to go and put a banner on the freeway, right? It's not expensive for someone to tell someone else about your product, right? It's not, if I tell Kara, hey, you got to download this app, right? You might actually check it out, right? And what would get me to do that? that moment of delight, right? Where I'm like, wow, like this is something that I haven't seen before, right? We mentioned Credit Karma earlier. They have this feature called Instant Karma, right? Like, could you imagine you make like a $200 purchase and then suddenly it's like, this has been reimbursed. It's instant karma for, making better financial decisions. Like, what? Like
Yeah.
that's exciting, right? I'm like, oh my God, I got to tell my wife.
Right.
And so that's really what it comes down to. How do you build something that solves a specific problem, really focus on that and create that moment of delight to start your flywheel?
That's fantastic. So I want to focus on that a little bit because I think that's
Sure.
so important, because I do agree that I think there's a lot out there, a lot of folks out there that are kind of at this fork in the road and they say, I don't know, how do I focus? Because there's so much they can do. And so, but I want to talk about how a company like Q2 supports that, right? Because I think sometimes they kind of know, like the brand knows what they need to build. They know their market, but they struggle to understand, like, okay, well, we can build this beautiful design and we can make a wonderful app, but how do we actually make that work behind the scenes? And although a lot of people think that banking is commoditized, and yes, like, yeah, the payment rails are the payment rails, the regulations are the regulations, but there's a lot of ways to kind of support that innovation and support the back office or the back behind the scenes kind of side of it. So how do you approach that? Is it like, because I know there's some BaaSes, for example, that are taking more of a work with less companies, but get way more in the weeds and way more hands-on, and others are building more of this like repeatable kind of get you off the ground in 6 weeks kind of thing. Talk to me a little bit about that and where you see that going.
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say first on that spectrum that you laid out, right? From here, we're going to work from the pre-seed startups, right, all the way over to we're going to focus on tier one enterprises. We tend to focus more here, right? Because where we're really good is taking your existing ecosystem, taking these modular components of banking, and 1 + 1 = 3, right? Building something new that is greater than the sum of its parts. So within that universe, right, if you think about the largest fintech companies, the largest brands that are trying to build these products, some of whom already build them on us today, they kind of need three basic things, right? They need the functionality in a modular fashion that's flexible, right? There's a lot kind of baked into that, right? But they need to be able to say, hey, if I want to offer an account to this individual, how can I modify it for that person? Like, how can I learn more about that person and create a product that's custom fit for them, right? And so the fact that our API is cloud-based, based on a proprietary core, easy to use and sort of collaborate with, and enables that is a big deal, right? Because they're able to say, oh, I can plug this component in to solve that problem and this component to solve that problem, and it functions well, right? The second, and this is true for our side of the spectrum more so than the startup side of the spectrum, but scale, right? It is not a small thing to be able to support tens of millions of people reliably, right? Consistently with no outages. And there are kind of two things that allow us to do that, right? There are a lot of BaaS players out there today that are what's called middleware providers, right? So they have middleware sitting on top of a legacy core. And for the folks on this side, the startup folks who are trying to get to market quickly for a low price, that model works, right? Because it lets you get some of the features you want and get to market relatively quickly. But as you start to scale, middleware can cause a point of integration failure, right? So you can have outages. It can cause issues as it pertains to transferring information. And at the end of the day, it makes it difficult to iterate your platform, right? Because you're reliant on the thing that you're the middleware platform for. Because we're a cloud-based core, right? We're able to basically scale on demand, right? Like, we've built our technology, we own the full stack, right? And we've already shown that we can support tens of millions of users, right? And so that's that second component. And then the third one that it kind of alludes to what you were talking about, right? People say today, hey, banks are commoditized, banking is commoditized, all that kind of stuff. First of all, I don't necessarily believe that because of the point around differentiation, right? But in that universe, right, if you're a business, a large business that's looking to build banking, which by the way isn't an add-on, right? It kind of fundamentally evolves your business. You want a partner who's done this before and who knows the traps, right? And who knows the roadblocks. It's kind of like, if you play like Super Mario or something like that, it's like you have to finish the game perfectly, right? You can either do it completely by yourself or you can do it with someone who's beaten the game 100 times, right? Probably gonna do the second one, right? Because that person can probably tell you, hey, there's gonna be a thing that's gonna show up and you're gonna have to avoid it, right? And in Q2's case, with more than 15 years of experience, starting from digital banking and going into being one of the first banking as a service players, we're not coming into this world from payments or from lending, right? We started in banking, right? This is our home, right? And so as folks are trying to build products that are innovative, right? And sometimes, are pushing the regulatory envelope, creating something that's brand new, right? You need someone who it knows how to work with regulation, knows how to work with regulators, that understands the technology side, that understands what it means to build a bank, and as we do on the digital banking side, that understands UI, UX, engagement, and customer acquisition, right?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you're not cutting a 1 year deal with someone to just get something to market, right? You're building a partnership, right,
Yeah.
with a company that's going to help you grow your business. And so I'd say that third piece around expertise is often overlooked, but pretty important as it comes to picking the right partner. So I'd say, to tie it in a bow and kind of answer your question, right? Those are the three things that we provide, and ultimately which ones are important for which clients will vary based off of expertise with financial services, what you're specifically looking to solve, where you are in the process. But we find that typically for those larger clients that we focus on, those are all the critical items.
That's awesome. That makes a lot of sense. I think it's funny. There's a lot of views on this, but I think a lot of times, in this world of APIs and, cookbooks and SDKs and all that good stuff, like there's a thought that can we almost eliminate the expertise? Can we almost eliminate the need for people, right? And I think that, yes, like the better we can get our documentation, the better we can get our technology, like that's all great stuff. But I don't think that it completely eliminates the need for that experience, right? And that ability to think between the lines. So
absolutely. I mean, like, this is maybe an unpopular statement, but banking is basically just managing risk, right? At the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
It comes down to like, how am I going to make the right decisions to manage my risk and grow my program, right? And along the way, there could be all kinds of things that influence that. And so it's important to have someone who can help you build the product in a way that's unique, right? That can help you navigate this new world of regulation and of product creation. And that also understands, hey, when you actually get that product to market, right, and you have millions of people on it, how do you optimize that, right? How do you lower your fraud rates? How do you improve your engagement? How do you improve your direct deposit conversion, for example, right? Which, for example, Q2 recently acquired ClickSwitch, right? And ClickSwitch now is helping some of our customers drive greater direct deposit conversion, which drives greater usage, right? And we can help them understand, hey, here's how you can leverage that to grow your business better, right? So the decision isn't just how do I get live? The decision is how do I build a meaningful business that drives bottom line impact, but that also drives, like significant, value increase for the company and for the customers.
That's awesome. So one last question for you. I've known Hank a long time, and his vision and all that good stuff, and it really starts with diversification in the U.S. banking system, right? And making sure that there's continues to be choice and options for everyone, really, whether you're a consumer or business. And a lot of that in back in the day was making sure that there were a lot of actual financial institutions, community banks and credit unions and the like. And obviously now, when we answer the question, what is banking earlier in the session, that's not always like, going into a branch or going to a bank's website specifically. So I think there's a lot of concern in the banking industry of like, are these fintechs going to replace these banks? And will there just be a handful of banks that are the plumbing and pipes behind these digital brands? So my question to you is, what can a community bank or these different banks that are looking to survive the next 10, 50, 100 years, what should they be thinking about? What should they be doing now to prepare for this shift and this change?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, right? And to your point, Q2's mission is how do we build stronger communities by strengthening those financial institutions, right? And I would say I don't believe that banks are going to become obsolete, right? I think that there will be types of banks, right, that focus on different things. I think there is absolutely a place for community banks, right? Community banks are to some extent the heartbeat of the communities they live in, right? Like they make most of the loans, they employ most of the people, right? Or rather, they indirectly help employ most of the people, right? But that isn't going to change, right? Those communities are going to continue to exist. If you live in Akron, Ohio, the odds of you being served by, one of the top 10 banks is maybe not that large, right? And you probably want that close relationship, right? So I still think there will be a universe of community banks that have that direct relationship, that focus on the customer, and their competitive advantage is their relationship, right? Yep. They've known these people, they've built that relationship, they know your kids, right? Yeah. And that's a big deal. Now, there will also be, community banks like the ones that work with our banking as a service product, which power other financial institutions. But don't get me wrong, some people will be like, oh yeah, those, banks, that's commoditized. that couldn't be further from the truth, right? Like
Exactly.
these banks are now partnering with fintechs to launch multifaceted, complex programs that serve most of the United States, right? And so
And you could argue they're launching digital communities, different types of communities, right?
exactly, exactly,
Yeah.
right? Like you see even some of those names that you mentioned, each of those has a little community, right? That's focused on it. And those communities have problems that they need solved, right? And so I think there'll be a universe of community banks that focus on that. And then I think there will be a universe of community banks that focus on providing utility, right? That focus on how can I facilitate, as you mentioned earlier, remittances, working with someone like Currency Cloud. How can I, facilitate payments, right? How can I facilitate merchant acquisition? There's a universe of stuff, right? That folks need. And so whether it's owning the direct relationship, partnering with someone to manage those kinds of direct relationships, or, playing more of a utility role and benefiting from those underlying fund flows in a position as a bank, I think there's still a huge space for the community banks in the United States. And I think, if anything, this new shift is actually really exciting for communities, right?
Yeah.
Because, think about it, right? Some of these community banks that are partnering with these fintechs, they would never get customers in, California or New York or all over the country, right? But now, with a partner that's exceptionally good at building product, at customer acquisition, at retention, at usage, all that kind of stuff, they're able to focus on what they're really efficient at, which is, building relationships, compliance, regulation, understanding the data, right, and what to do about it. And it's kind of a symbiotic partnership, right, where both sides, actually all three sides, if you count Q2, are doing what they're efficient at, right? The bank is focused on those items. Q2 is focused on building a best-in-class kind of banking as a service platform, and the fintech is focused on building a product that solves their specific customers' problems. And whenever you can find those kinds of efficiencies, I say go for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you. I have a similar view that I think that if anything, it's going to secure the future of community banking in the U.S. and continue to allow us to all innovate and solve those problems where they actually lie and exist. Well, thank you. I know we're a little bit over time here. Anything else that you'd like to share with the audience? No, my fault. I was asking all the questions. Anything else you'd like to leave with the audience before we wrap up today?
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you, for inviting us, letting us be a part of this discussion. I figured we'd go long. We always tend to go long, but I appreciate you taking the time. I guess to the folks in the audience, I would say, think different, right? Like, ask yourself what the white space is, right? Don't just look at your competition and say, how do I replicate those features, right? Don't just look at the people that have millions of users and say, how do I become the next that? Because guess what? You're X years behind, right? Look at the white space. There are tons of problems that exist. People have real problems. And if you listen to those users and you focus on one problem to start, I promise you'll make a meaningful business as long as you have a good business model to back it up.
I love that. Thank you so much, Ahon. Really appreciate the time. And we'll have you back on soon.